Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Climate alarmists haven't been doing too well with getting people to fall in line with their demands. If they can't win a scientific debate, they try to find messengers who are unimpeachable. Their latest attempt is a little blonde girl from Sweden in pigtails. The idea is that this little girl who's parroting the propaganda she's heard all her life is somehow wise and knowledgeable about science. Greta Thunberg doesn't bother to go to school because she believes that the world is going to end in a few years. Not to mention the fact that she's having the time of her life, traveling all over the world and probably getting very rich. The UN has invited her to be their official climate spokesperson next week. And her team of propagandists came up with the idea of her sailing to the United States in a sailboat. The concept behind this stunt is that she will emit less carbon dioxide traveling on the sailboat than she would occupying a seat on a plane which was going to travel across the Atlantic anyway. Had she just taken a regularly scheduled commercial flight, her carbon footprint would have been essentially zero. But instead, the stunt they planned out for her has support people flying all over the world, emitting huge amounts of carbon dioxide. Just look at that face, you can see how worried she is about the future. She'll probably never have to work a day in her life after reaping all the windfall profits from the scam they're pulling. So why bother to go to school? I would do the same thing if I was in her place. Greta will go to the UN next week and read a speech which was carefully prepared for her by some of the world's leading propagandists. She will say that children of her generation face a terrible future of heat, famine, disease, and every other imaginable natural disaster. Basically, she will describe a life which is the exact opposite of the charmed life she's living. And her prophecies of doom will be described by the press as a magnet for hope. Her message of hope will be that if we simply lower carbon dioxide levels back to those of the pre-industrial era, everything will be fine. Well, let's test that theory out. We don't have to guess what the world was like at lower CO2 levels because we have huge amounts of historical information. This was the front page of the New York Times on this date in 1916. Like Greta, no children in New York or many other cities were going to school then. There was a massive outbreak of polio, which was called infantile paralysis at the time. The schools were shut down to keep infantile paralysis from spreading. The headline is, Paralysis Crest Believed Past. Day report lists only 92 new cases, the smallest total since June 28th. That's almost one new case of polio every 15 minutes, and that was a good day. Here's an article about the 1916 polio pandemic in the Open Microbiology Journal. Hospitals in New York were overwhelmed by the epidemic. These children in Billings, Montana were victims of the 1916 low CO2 polio pandemic. I would guess that any one of those children would be happy to trade places with the charmed life of Greta Thunberg. And 2 years later came the worst pandemic in human history. As many as 40 million people died in the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918-1919. Coughs and sneezes from people who were infected were described as being as dangerous as poison gas shells from World War I. The New York Times reported that 20 to 40 million people died in that pandemic, which made it even worse than the Black Death. And if polio, World War I, and the worst pandemic in human history wasn't bad enough, much of Europe was starving to death in 1919. This hunger map of Europe was published in the New York Times in 1919. People facing very real problems like the world had from 1916 through 1919 don't have a lot of time to obsess about mindless fantasies like climate change. All indications are that Greta is well-fed and not starving like children in Europe were 100 years ago. Greta Thunberg has no real problems and she has a charmed life, but that's not the story her propagandists want you to hear. In her speech to the United Nations next week, Greta will no doubt read lines telling Americans that they face a future of extremely hot summers. So let's look at what the weather was like on this date in 1916 when the New York schools were shut down due to the polio epidemic. That was quite a remarkable day. There were 100-degree temperatures all the way from Oregon into upstate New York. It was 101 degrees at Ithaca, New York on August 22, 1916. That's where I just spent this past weekend. Ithaca is the home of Cornell University and has a very good set of temperature records going back to at least 1895. Ithaca has only had 10 days over 100 degrees since the start of records, and all of them occurred more than 80 years ago. There were 3 in 1911, one on this date in 1916, 2 in 1931, 1 in 1933, and 3 in 1936, and none since then. I'm guessing that Greta's speechwriters probably won't include this in her speech. Across the United States, the likelihood of hot summer weather has plummeted over the last century. This graph shows the percent of hot summer days at all U.S. Historical Climatology Network stations from 1895 to this year. The blue bar is the percent of summer readings above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The red bar is the percent of summer readings above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And the yellow bar is the percent of summer readings above 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. So the y-axis shows the total of all three groups. So in the case of 1936, it actually came out to more than 100%. This year has followed the continuing downward trend and is actually one of the least hot summers on record in the United States. On this date in 1936, there were 100 and 110 degree temperatures all over the Midwest and eastern U.S. It was incredibly hot, kind of heat which we just don't see anymore. 4 states were over 110 degrees and 21 states were over 100 degrees on this date in 1936. Missouri was 112 degrees that day and Indiana was 111 degrees. Temperatures like that in the Midwest are completely inconceivable now. Greta's speech certainly won't include the information that U.S. heat waves have declined sharply over the last 90 years. And she certainly wouldn't know it herself because she's been fed nothing but propaganda for her entire life. And she doesn't attend school. The former UN climate spokesman, Leonardo DiCaprio, is also a high school dropout. And he also likes to travel on his 450-foot yacht, which is always covered with climate models. The use of little blonde girls in pigtails is a long-standing tradition for propagandists. A little blonde girl in pigtails was one of the more famous icons of the German National Socialists in the 1930s. The one they chose in the 1930s also happened to be the daughter of Heinrich Himmler. I was listening to an NPR discussion the other day where they were talking about flight-shaming people over their plane travel. The discussion was so absurd and meaningless, it made me think of the days when scholars argued over how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. The United States and Sweden and many other countries could drop off the face of the earth, and China is going to continue building coal-fired power plants. Because of all the construction going on in Asia, there's nothing that the United States and Sweden can do to prevent CO2 emissions from continuing to increase. The New York Times describes building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants as joining the climate fight. Sometimes it's difficult to believe that there's people evil enough to try to achieve their political goals by scaring children, but that's exactly what's going on. The desperate tactics of using this little girl for propaganda seems doomed to failure, and we all need to do our part to make sure that's the case. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.